Hello, I'm Samantha Nolan-Smith, and this is Lessons in Visibility. In this show, we ask what can be learned from the two faces of visibility. The first involves stepping forward and choosing to be seen and heard. The second opens you up to new ways of seeing and hearing the world around you. Welcome to the show. Hello, it's lovely to be with you again. In this episode, I wanted to share a story that one of our students, Bayan, she lives in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and she's the founder of Be Equitable, a Saudi consultancy specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bayan has been a student of Women Speaking Up for a number of years, and I asked her if she would share some of her visibility journey with us and some of the lessons that she has drawn from that experience. So that's what I'm going to dive into today. Bayan said, my story with invisibility is rooted to where I live. It's connected to the society I grew up in and the patriarchal discourses that were the norm back then. If you're not aware, Saudi Arabia has changed a lot over the fairly recent past and is becoming a much more open society. And some of the attitudes, particularly toward women, have been changing. And so in Bayan's story, that's reflected. She says, my invisibility is rooted to the patriarchal discourses that were the norm back then, recognizing that this is changing. And she talks about the identity that then she carried with her across the world after that. Bayan says, my upbringing conditioned me to be the good girl who wouldn't draw attention to herself, who couldn't be too much, who must follow expectations, who should be unseen, make little to no noise, and follow the norms. Because the School of Visibility community is a global community and the Women Speaking Up community is a global one as well, I'm always interested in how people from very different cultures end up sharing quite similar experiences around visibility. For me, it speaks to the human experience and the universality of that. And it speaks to the universality of some of those systems of silencing, like patriarchy, like homophobia. There are obviously gradations around that, and what we experience in the West is quite different to what is experienced in other parts of the world, particularly if you're a member of the LGBTIA community. And still, the messaging is very similar. Don't be too much, follow expectations, don't draw attention to yourself, be a good girl. So Bayan says that this felt like a normal thing when I was part of the majority culture. But then I got married and I moved with my husband to Melbourne in Australia to continue my studies. And then we moved to Canada and studied more there. And both of those paradigm shifts shifted her perspective as she was then living in countries where her Muslim identity was a minority identity. And in being a minority, she started to recognize that she could have a voice to speak up for herself and for others. And so she says, I advocated for my Muslim identity through my master's, presenting in conferences that I felt were safe spaces where I felt like I would be seen. And the twist really came when I came back to Saudi Arabia in 2017, and I felt like I was losing my voice again. This, I think, is a really interesting point in Bayan's story, which is I went into a place where I was the minority, and by virtue of being the minority, I got in touch with my voice. And then when I went back to a place where I was part of the majority, I felt that I had lost my voice again. So this is an interesting perspective that I don't feel that I talk about very much. Because normally when I'm talking about being the minority, I'm talking about how being in that role minimizes our voices. But I love the way that Bayan reflects that actually it can also spark your voice, because for the first time you suddenly see, oh, hang on, there's a need for a voice here that wasn't needed in my country. I didn't need to speak up for my Muslim identity in Saudi Arabia, but I did need to speak up for my Muslim identity in Australia and in Canada. So this brings forth for me something that I think about a lot, and that's how are people's voices sparked? When are people's voices sparked, and what sparks them. And so I wanted to particularly share that piece with you because that may well open something up for you in your own world, thinking about that kind of experience. Bayan goes on to say that this time, coming back to Saudi Arabia, I had to build up my voice again, but this time it was from within. And so that was her lesson. Her lesson was to start with the inner work. And she said, and the good thing was that my country was changing as well towards women's empowerment and toward dismissing patriarchy. I went back to her and I asked her, could you talk more about how you felt you had lost your voice when you returned home? She said, yes, there's probably three things. Firstly, there was the language. I wasn't familiar with some of the social terms in Arabic. I'd learned how to speak up and be an advocate in English, but not in Arabic. Back in 2017, which is when she returned home, the empowerment and advocate vocabularies were not as commonly used in Arabic as they were in English. Plus, some of the social terms didn't exist in Arabic until recent years. Sexism, ableism, mansplaining, there's still no translation for mansplaining. So I've often had students who have been from non-English speaking countries who have reflected some version of this, where the role of women in different societies doesn't look the same. And the conversations have been around, how do I take these concepts from English-speaking countries and then translate them into my language, into my culture in a way that will be acceptable? I've always been speaking to people about that in the context of visibility. How do I show up and speak about this stuff when nobody's really speaking about this stuff in my country? So you might want to consider that from the perspective of your own work, where particular ways of doing things in the West, and particularly in English-speaking countries, may or may not be the right approach for all of your students. For myself, when I speak to people from different nations, I'm very cognizant of what might be okay to speak about and what might actually put somebody in danger to speak about. And there are certainly many countries where speaking up on particular topics will endanger the person. And so that's something to consider for yourself. Do you understand other people's cultures sufficiently to be able to hold space safely for them, to be able to give them advice or guidance or mentoring that is culturally appropriate? That, I think, is something that there's not enough conversation about. There's a lot of dominance of English-speaking values, and we need more visibility around the social conditions that people from other countries find themselves in. So I leave that reflection for you from Bayan's story. She secondly says, the other way that I had lost my voice was the environment, coming back into my culture where there was a stereotypical lifestyle, certain jobs for women, certain visibility for women and mothers is expected. So I drifted back into my default of the good girl who doesn't want to upset or offend anyone by speaking her truth and being herself. I wouldn't get into controversial arguments with people who I know are judgmental, and I would prefer to keep my opinions to myself during controversial discussions in extended family gatherings. I felt no one would understand what I was going through, from having reverse culture shock to depression to feeling stuck in societal restrictions around women. And this continued until I learned that I could find like-minded communities online that offer a safe space to express myself. So that's another part of Bayan's journey. And I think that anybody who has traveled away from home, has lived overseas or perhaps in another city and then come home, can relate in many ways to that experience of who am I supposed to be here versus who I was when I was somewhere else. There's a freedom to being in places where people don't know you. You can experiment, you can think new thoughts, you can wear new outfits, you can try lots of things, and nobody's going to say, hang on, that's not who we know you to be. And then returning home can feel like getting back in a box. So one of the important points of transition in terms of visibility is, how do I hold on to my voice when I return to a place where I didn't have such a voice when I left? And then the third thing that Bayan shares is she says, the third way in which I lost my voice was myself. I didn't have the strength to use my voice publicly. I lacked empowerment myself. And then she says, so she joined online communities, including Women Speaking Up, which allowed her to release many of her blocks by expressing myself and being more able to share my thoughts with the world. This, I think, points to the importance of community, of surrounding yourself by like-minded people. Sometimes we don't have those connections in our real world. I'm saying real world in inverted commas, but we make those connections online, and those connections online bolster us to then be able to be more visible or more vocal in our real life communities. And sometimes it's the opposite. We have a lovely friendship group or whatever it might be around us, and we get bolstered by that. And then as a consequence of that, we feel sufficiently confident to be able to speak up in virtual spaces as and where we need to. So there is a lot of visibility lessons, I think, that we can take from Bayan's experience and Bayan's story. If you want to connect with her, if you want to do any work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have worked with Bayan around ensuring that our content is culturally appropriate to the Arab world. I will leave her links in the show notes. And I feel like there have been many lessons from today. And I hope that there has been one that sparks something for you. Perhaps you see yourself in part of Bayan's story and feel less alone, or you recognize that this is a universal experience, or perhaps it's opened up a new perspective on a way to approach things inside your own business or inside your own programs. Thank you, Bayan, for the lessons that you have shared with us today. Thanks for listening to Lessons in Visibility. If you'd like to connect in other places, come on over to theschoolofvisibility.com. And you can also find us at The School of Visibility on Instagram, Substack, Facebook, and Threads. Lessons in Visibility is produced by the School of Visibility on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I acknowledge the peaceful legacy of custodianship that tens of thousands of years of coexistence with the land has bestowed on us all. And I note the visibility journey that remains unfinished. Voice, treaty, truth.